Now you get oil leaks in your car, they can come from many places. It can be a stinker figuring out where they're coming from because, as my father always said, don't assume it's only one leak. You could have lots of leaks. The old way was to clean everything off. The engine, the transmission, dry it. Real pain in the butt, then seeing where the leak's coming from. Well, today things are a lot simpler. You get ultraviolet leak dye that's made for engine oil, a UV light, see? Shining UV, and yellow sunglasses so you can see where the dye's coming out. In this case, I can see engine oils coming from around here, but when I go under the car, I can see the bottom of the engine's got a lot of oil on it. Not the transmission, but just the engine. We're pouring the engine oil if we can get it open. It's on there tight. I guess they were worried that was leaking, so they put it on super tight. Pour it in. Put the top back on and drive it around about 15-20 minutes. Okay, now it's driven around. It'll circulate all the oil dye so we can figure out where the leak's coming from. And like I said, it could come from many places. Don't just think one is it. That's why the dye is best. You don't have to worry about cleaning off the old stuff because the dye will glow where it's leaking from, and you'll be able to see any oil leak. So luckily these fit over my glasses, so I can get the yellow, kind of weird looking, but let's start looking around. You can often get a little oil seepage around the valve cover gasket on an engine that's got over 200,000 miles. That's not where the oil is dripping to the bottom. That's just seepage. It doesn't show any dye coming out yet, so that's just a minor thing. So we'll jack it up in there and look under the engine. Now we get a little mat and a jack stand. And as we go under, we can see it's wet around. Now, you don't really notice much, but when you put the dye on, okay, there it is. Green dye's coming from up in here. And what's up here? Well, that's the front main seal of the engine. And when we look at the back side of the engine, there's some more. It's leaking from the back side of the engine, too. Now, the front side is bad enough because you got to take the front of the engine apart, the timing belt off. You'd have to change the front main seal. While you're at it, you might as well change the oil pump seal and the camshaft seals, which is expensive enough. But the rear main seal leak is between the engine and the transmission. And you either have to pull the transmission off or the engine, and that costs a lot of money. I'm going to try this LubeGuard seal fix. LubeGuard makes some pretty good products. I've been trying this out because the AT205 is kind of hard to find, and this seems to be similar stuff. I think it might be exactly the same. It's because, look, it looks like water, right? Looks like water. That's exactly what the AT205 reseal looks like. So I think this has the same stuff in it. So what you do, pour it in the engine oil, the whole bottle. The only time will tell if this works, but I really think it's the same as the AT205 reseal because main seals, power steering, automatic manual transmissions, and differentials. And that's exactly what I use the AT205 reseal that I can't get here. In Rhode Island, nobody sells it. You got to wait a few hours of operating time. You drive it around, you have to do it all at once, you can drive it over time. And basically, it even warns you. It says if it's still leaking like mad after 2 or 3 hours, get it mechanically fixed. Well, this is not leaking like mad. It hasn't even dripped on the ground here yet. It will eventually. But rather than pulling the engine out or the transmission out, taking the whole front of the engine apart, if this fixes it, hey, you saved yourself a ton of money. I realize this, any car that's got over 200,000 miles on it, hey, the seals are going to be somewhat worn from the engine spinning them, right? Let's say this works and it stops leaking. All you have to do is every time you change your engine oil and filter, add another bottle. Because when you change the oil and filter, you're also getting rid of this additive, which to me looks like the same polymer that AT205 has. It's got the same direction, so I'm assuming it's the same stuff. It even looks the same, right? You have a problem like this that isn't especially major like this. I've seen these things actually stop when they're pouring out. But with a little drip like this, I get a pretty good idea that this is going to really either slow it down or stop it entirely. Now, of course, in a perfect world, you would pull the engine or transmission out, replace the front main seal, the oil pump, camshaft seals on top of the engine. But let's face it, it's an old car with over 200,000 miles. You're going to spend over $1,000 having that kind of work done. If this stops it, and you only got to pay $14 every time you change an oil extra for pouring this stuff in, what the heck? Especially in terms of a Toyota. They make pretty good seals. They generally don't crack and break apart, they just get somewhat worn. And since these seals are an oil seal that has a spring inside it, the spring is holding the seal on. So if the seal isn't all supple and pliable, it'll leak. But if this makes the rubber more pliable, the spring holding it on will help hold it in. That's why this stuff works for seals, not oil gaskets. Because a gasket, like on an engine, it's bolted in place, right? It's just sitting there. And if it's worn out, it's cracked, and then it starts leaking oil. Let's say you had a side oil leak and it's a gasket, not an oil seal, just a gasket. You can go and try to tighten it. Sometimes they shrink in tightening and they won't leak, or sometimes you tighten and they'll leak even more if they're cracked, and that breaks them entirely, come pouring out. No sealer is going to fix that. You can't put a sealer in, for example, that's going to stop valve cover leaks, because that's just a valve cover gasket. It's not an oil seal. But in this case, it's the oil seals that are leaking. So why do these oil seals leak? Unfortunately, there's only two reasons. One is if you buy a poorly made car and it's got poorly made seals, they leak because they weren't made right, and after so many hundreds or thousands or millions of rotations, they just wear out and they start pouring out. But in the case of Toyotas, the main reason the oil seals leak is because people don't change the oil enough. That's why you want to change your engine oil every 5,000 miles or so, or once a year. Because the oil seals are made out of rubber, right? I mean, GM tried some Teflon seals. Boy, they didn't work. They leak like a sieve, and everybody replaced them with regular rubber ones later. You got dirty oil. What is dirt? Dirt is friction, like sandpaper if it's dirty enough. It's bad enough that friction and dirt is wearing the metal pistons in your engine, which of course takes a really long time to wear them out, right? They're made out of rubber. And what's going to happen with rubber? When it gets friction on it, it will have much more wear on it than metal. So even though you might think, oh, it's just an oil seal, it only costs $22. Yeah, but if you got to pull the engine or transmission out to replace that seal, that $22 is going to go up to $1,000 or more in many places. It's an awful lot of work that you can avoid in the first place by just changing the oil regularly. I say, no, it's an old vehicle, I don't need to change the oil on it. If it leaks or burn oil, I just add it. You still got to change it. How do you think this 17-year-old motorcycle still runs like a top, doesn't drip any oil? Look how shiny it is. There's no oil leaking. There's no oil leaking on the floor. My wife would be mad after I made a nice floor, right? And it's 17 years old. Because the oil has been changed regularly. It's taken care of. It goes really fast because it's been taken care of. And the main thing, if you do nothing on a vehicle other than put air in the tires when it gets low, go and change the oil every 5,000 miles or so with full synthetic oil. That's a better oil, lubricates better, keeps cleaner. And of course, if you live in northern climates, it flows better. So instead of having a car, when I was young, they had straight weight oil, 10 weight oil, 20 weight oil, 30 weight oil, 40 weight oil, just one weight. And if you had the summer 40 weight oil in the winter, you'd crank the engine over, and it'd start up. Synthetic oils flow great and they'll start right up in the winter. So there's a lot of reasons you want to do it. They'll last longer and you won't have to spend money fixing things that cost a fortune that would have never broken except that you didn't change the oil enough. Just remember this, it's simple. Oil, cheap. Engines, expensive. Even changing a $20 engine rear main oil seal is expensive because you either got to pull the engine or the transmission out to do the work. Why you'd want to take a chance of that versus just changing the oil is beyond me. Strangest thing is, of course, it's more important to do on an older car because the new car's new and the seals are new, and of course they're going to seal better, right? But an old car, everything's old. You actually need to take better care of an older car than you do a newer car. So just keep changing your oil every 5,000 miles. Cheap thing, do it yourself. If you don't, find a place that does it for a reasonable price that doesn't rip you off. But the way it is today, everybody rips everybody off. So even the oil change joints, you go to them, they'll try to sell you 50 things while you're getting your oil changed, and they'll sell you some bulk oil that's in a container that they buy cheap. And I know a guy who runs a discount oil thing, he buys his oil filters for 99 cents a piece, right? Hey, you don't want 99-cent oil filters, you want quality ones. So if you do it yourself, believe me, you're going to save a lot of money in the long run, and you're not going to have to worry about people trying to sell you a bunch of crap that you don't actually need. Now, the leak stop will take 200-300 miles to really do its job, but I was just talking to the husband who owns this car. He tells me they keep having a ton of oil. It's not leaking a ton of oil. It's only leaking a little. This is the infamous Toyota 2.4-liter engine that burns oil because the piston rings are worn out. All I got to do is pull out a spark plug, take the cover off, take out one spark plug. First, take the coil off, remove it, and we'll check one spark plug. We can see it's burning oil. The firing end is oily. It's burning oil. So it's burning oil. You'll live with that. My grandson's got one, Camry, same engine, burns oil. He carries oil in the trunk and adds it. Every time he fills it up, he checks it. And then adds whatever he needs to add. Simple to do, but you're not going to rebuild an engine on an old car like this. It's not worth it. Put the spark plug back in, put the coil back on, bolt it in place, and put the beauty cover back on. It's not very beautiful anymore, but it's here, so you might as well stick it back on. And realize you're just going to be adding oil to it a lot. You live with that, you don't rebuild an engine, but it can still run a long time. It happens to all of us. The stupid check engine light comes on. The owner of the Chevy took it to various places. They told him various stories. He went to an auto parts store. They sold him the wrong part. So let's go through it the right way and figure out what the heck's going on here. So we're going to get out the big guns and not mess around. This will tell us everything we need to know and more. And here we go. Start setting it up. Now, he did notice when his check engine light came on, his gas mileage got worse. So there's a reason to look into it. There are hundreds of things it can be. Don't ever guess. Use a scan tool. And in this case, I'm using the top line scan tool because I'm going to find everything that's wrong with this car and find out if anybody was telling the truth or whether they were all fools. We'll do an intelligent diagnosis. It's just like gambling. Chevy Colorado 2007. There it is. We'll go to diagnosis and we'll do a whole system scan. Here we go. It checks everything. Doesn't take all that long either. Goes through all the different systems. Check out the report. Now we're doing the smart scan. It's going to find what's good and what's bad. And since it's color coded, obviously red is bad, green is good. Okay. So we'll start out with the PCM. It's got a code. DO449, evap emission evap vent solenoid control circuit. Now that's a code for the evap system. Something's going on with the vent solenoid. Could be a bad vent solenoid. Could be wiring. But that's not really going to make the vehicle run poorly at all. It's just an anti-pollution thing. So let's look at the other 6 codes here. Well, the electronic brake control module, he knew the ABS was acting up. And it's got a code for the left front wheel speed sensor, the right front wheel speed sensor, the left front anti-lock brake system, channel in release too long. It's taking too long to release. The right front anti-lock brake system is taking too long to release. It lost communication with the computer, and it lost communication with the body control module and dash integration module. Well, we know the ABS didn't work, and now we know it would probably cost a small fortune to make it work. Just realize the ABS isn't working correctly. Drive normally. I only have one car that has ABS. All the rest don't, so to me it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Well, now comes the big guns. We're going to analyze the live data stream and try to figure out what's happening, why his gas mileage went down. We're looking at the air-fuel ratio. 14.7 to 1 is perfect. And what is this? 14.70 to 1. So that's working okay. Okay, we know it's not the engine coolant temperature. That's got the right temperature. Knew it had an evap problem, right? It's probably a bad evap vent valve because the car's idling. And when the car is idling, it's not supposed to vent. And here it says evap vent solenoid is commanding venting. So it's only supposed to vent when the car's sitting. It goes through the charcoal canister, gets rid of the hydrocarbons, and pure air, theoretically at least, comes out of the vent on the top. But it's venting now when it's running, which it should never do. So either there's an electronic problem commanding it when it shouldn't, or the valve itself has gone bad. But that's really not going to make the thing run bad. So let's keep looking. Now, for some reason, the long-term fuel trim is 7.81%. So it's adding 7.8% fuel in the long term. So for some reason, the computer thinks the vehicle's running lean, doesn't have enough fuel, so it's adding 7.8% fuel, and that's enough to make it have crappy gas mileage. Well, let's look at some more information. Now, here's another weird thing. The short-term fuel trim as it's running, it's actually subtracting 3%, 0.78%, so it's actually running rich at idle, but lean at high speeds. Let's rev it up a little. See how I rev it up, and now it's adding fuel. Now it's 0, but it's adding fuel and then subtracting fuel. The short-term fuel trim is showing what's happening right now. The long-term over time. So long-term, it thinks it's running lean and it's adding fuel, but short-term, it's subtracting fuel. This is kind of a classic sign of the fuel injectors are a bit dirty, because it might sound crazy, but a dirty fuel injector, they're supposed to make an upside down cone, perfectly shaped cone to spray atomize the fuel. If, let's say, they're dirty, you might think, well, they're dirty, give less fuel, so you know it wouldn't be running rich when it's idling. But no, because if it's dirty, instead of spraying a nice mist, it globs, and the globs have too much fuel, so it makes it run rich, because the globs aren't a mist, and it's run a little bit too rich. So when I revved it up, it It actually went the opposite way. A lot of times a dirty fuel injector will do just that. Well, let's check out the misfire data, see if it misfires at all. Now we're going on 80, 88 cycles of misfire data. See if it shows any. What do we have? Misfire. It's a 5-cylinder. 0. So it's not having any misfires. But if we look closely, over time, we'll look at the history. The top ones are alive up to a certain amount. This is the total history, and the total history shows 2 on cylinder number 2. All the others are 0. For some reason, cylinder number 2 has a history of 2 misfires. He's owned this since new. He's never changed the spark plugs. That is the numero uno thing to do. A small amount of misfires. I've seen them where they have hundreds. This one was only 2. It's not much, but if they're all worn over time, it'll get cumulative, and it can start giving you worse gas mileage, especially as the gap starts to stretch on it. So get all this plastic crap out of the way, and presto, now we got some room. We'll check out the spark plugs. We'll take the ignition coil off, and pull out a spark plug. Oh, we'll take out the spark plug, look at it. Worn out spark plugs. So you got new spark plugs, and here's a warning. Modern spark plugs are all coated. You don't have to put any NICs on them. If you do, they won't be on right. So just put them in like this. Stick it in. Now you can use a torque wrench if you want. You get them finger tight, then put on a ratchet. This is on. Then go just a little. That's perfect. Now we'll put the ignition coil back on. We'll do the other 4. Always change all of them. Don't be foolhardy and change just one. Unless you have an old junky engine where one cylinder's so worn it eats them up. Then you can change just one at a time. Never ever forget to tighten the clamps, because if you don't tighten the clamps, you get an air leak. The mass airflow sensor measures the air coming in. If this leaks, you'll have unmetered air going in. Your car will run like crap. Simple thing to check. Just make sure you get them nice and tight. So let's check it out. All right now, people who know me well know I'm not a big GM fan, but this 5-cylinder inline engine is actually an excellent engine. I had a customer in Houston with over 350,000 miles on his, and it burned a quart of oil about every 1,200 miles, but not bad. This particular one doesn't burn any oil at all yet, so they're not extremely powerful engines, but they can tow enough weight, and they can last an awful long time. Let's take it for a road test. Now you can see that 5-cylinder engine, it's in gear. They're smooth idling engines. It's one of the reasons they made 6 cylinders, and then they had a few experimental 5s from various companies, and they all work quite well. Now Audi's made 5-cylinder engines for years that were notorious for smooth power bands. There's nothing wrong with a 5-cylinder engine. They just never were all that popular. Now this truck has positive traction in the back, and it's got that 5-cylinder engine. Let's see what it does in our little track here in a second, when this car gets out of the way. Well, we're gonna have to go now. It's got decent oomph to it. It's a very good little pickup truck. So now you know. In this case, it needed spark plugs. People are going to try to sell you a ton of stuff. People told them all kinds of insanity. They said you needed oxygen sensors, blah, blah, blah. He didn't need any of that. Now, he didn't care about the ABS. 3 of the sensors have problems. Who's even going to bother fixing it? Stop's good enough. Check engine lights on because it's got an evap leak. If it runs good enough now and gets good enough gas mileage, he's going to leave that alone too. Scan tool, a little bit of information. There's a lot of stuff you could fix in your car. Now, you don't need a fancy one like I have, that fancy. It just makes it a lot easier to cover all bases. Even if you didn't have a scan tool. You never change the spark plugs in it. It's the original spark plugs on a car that's, what, 15 years old. So, what the heck? Change the spark plugs. It's not hard. You got a Toyota Highlander that's running poorly, and the woman who owns it wonders if the work she's been paying for has even been done, so we're going to check all that. The first thing we're going to check is, there's a bunch of lights on. Some of them we don't care, but as we go to the back, you can hear it's not running right. Hear the thumping? It's definitely misfiring. You see the check engine light is flashing. When it's flashing, it means there's something relatively serious wrong. So, always start with a quick look. It's definitely shaking. I don't hear any vacuum leaks or anything. A lot of times these hoses get knocked off, but you can see they're all still there. So we'll get the old computer out. Now she's had it for about 8 years. You can see it's got 258,000 miles on it. So we'll get out the plug, stick it in the OBD plug, and we'll start analyzing. Got some wear in it. You can see she's not a smoker, but the previous owner was. She was given the car. She does a lot of driving. That's how it got all this mileage on it. But here we go. cylinder 1 misfire detected. So it's cylinder number 1 misfire. So we'll take the beauty cover off, which is a dumb thing anyways. In this case, it's bolted on, so we have to unbolt it. They really went all out on these. So I'll take off the beauty cover. What we're gonna do is we're gonna swap coil number 1 with another coil. Now, of course, you'll know it's a stinker because the number 1 cylinder's hiding under here. So we gotta get in there and take it out. We're gonna swap the number 1 with the front here and the front there, and we'll see if the mist moves. So we'll do the easy one first. We'll take this coil off and remove it. A lot of times they stick, so you wiggle them a little. Now what we're going to do is we're going to change this coil for the 1. If the misfire moves from here to here, we'll know that's a bad coil, and we just have to replace the coil. Now there would have been a lot of cursing and swearing getting that out, but the lady's standing behind me, so I stopped that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put the coil from the front in the back, and the one that says it's misfiring in the front. If the misfire moves, we'll know it just needs a coil. I just have to put it back in, because then the bad one's going to be in the front. And it'll be real easy to change if that's the problem. Here's a tip. To get to the back one to get it out, there's a 10 milliliter bolt you can't reach. But with one of these flex head wrenches, you can reach it. The front ones, they're real easy to get to. It doesn't matter. But the back one, there's no room. So you need one of these to get it back on. Got the ignition coil. This is the one that we think is bad that was on number 1. And we're going to move it over here. Screw it on, and we'll plug the connector in. That's what holds it on. And now, the first thing we're going to do is turn the key on. Turn the key on, and we'll erase the code. Now we have to do that because it's got the stored code. So we'll do erase code. Now it's erasing the codes. If we don't erase it, the code will still be there. It'll confuse us. You can see when we check it, the codes are gone, so we'll start it up. Now you can see the check engine isn't on yet, but we're going to have to drive it around, and hopefully it'll come back, and we'll see if it's moved, this misfire, away from the number 1 that we moved. Well, it's getting all ready to drive around, but the check engine light came on, flashing on and off, and misfire cylinder 6, PL306, number 6. Well, we moved 1 to 6, so now 6 is misfiring, so we know it's just that ignition coil. Not shaking anymore, bolt this back on. Not that it serves any purpose, but we put it on anyway. Not too shabby for an old car with all this mileage on it. Now she wanted to check the tires, so I'll get a tire gauge out. We'll check them. Let's check the tire pressure. That's 28. Check this one. That's the same. So far they were both the same. That's the same. And the last one, that's the same too. Now as I look at them, they're not too old. That one's not dry rotting. That one's not dry rotting. This one's not dry rotting, and neither is this, and I got plenty of tread. Now she does a reasonable amount of driving for the church. So she said she drives 12 to 14,000 miles a year. So that also keeps everything going because you're using it all the time. If you don't drive much, they'll dry rot, they'll slide, they'll get out around spots because they sit all the time. But she drives us enough that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the tires. A lot of people, as they age, don't drive much, and then the tires, even though they look good, when you get close, you'll see cracks on them, they'll lose air, then you gotta replace them. But these are still in really good shape. She drives all that many miles, they're not oddly worn, they still have the same amount of pressure in them, so she doesn't have to worry about that. It's an older car, of course. The tire pressure monitoring system doesn't work anymore. It costs too much money to fix that stuff. But there is one more thing we can turn off. Now you can see there's the maintenance required light, so we're going to turn it off, which is easy to do. You just push the odometer reset, then turn the key on, and you can see now it's off. She did say she's got a little oil leak, so we'll check under here, and we can see a little bit of seepage there, which is typical on these things. It isn't too bad because it hasn't even reached the ground yet. What that is typical. On these, you'll often get a little bit of leakage on the front main seal of the engine. You get close to 300,000 miles, you'll get a little seepage here and there. You're not going to tear the engine apart to replace a main seal. It'd be foolhardy. It's not even really dripping on the ground. But they all do that. And I looked at the other side. The rear main seal is leaking a tiny bit. And you live with that. Oil's cheap. Pulling an engine out to change the seal costs a fortune. So that, you don't worry about it. Like I said, it's not even make it to the ground. They're going to look typically like this engine does. And the mileage, I mean, you put your hand there, yeah. See, there's a little oil, but I mean, hey, they all seep a little bit, and it's going to hurt anything. It may be old, it may have come in here running poorly, but it's leaving running quite fine just by a little ignition coil. You ever think you got a bad one, you got a misfire? Swap them, just like I did. Put it in, fixes it. We're just happy that it wasn't the one in the back in the middle, because that one you got to pull the whole intake manifold to get to. At least we were lucky enough that it wasn't that one, because that is a job taking the back of the top of the engine off. This case, there was enough room to get to the number 1 and swap it out. And as you can see, hey, it may be old, but this thing, I've seen it with 500,000 miles in Texas. It's still going strong after all these years, and it was a simple fix. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.